look at the map of the Middle East. You see a masterclass in encirclement. Iran has built a ring of fire around its enemies. Thousands of missiles pointed at the heart of Israel and American bases. But power in geopolitics is not measured by the rockets on the launch pad. It is measured by the supply lines that feed them. And right now, deep inside Tehran, the financial and logistical arteries of this empire are bleeding out. The proxy war is bankrupt. To understand the architecture of the modern Middle East, you must abandon the illusion that ideology drives geopolitical outcomes. Ideology is merely the currency used to purchase foot soldiers, the true engine of statecraft, the unforgiving metric that decides who commands the region and who submits is logistics, geography, and industrial capacity. For the past 4 decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran has executed one of the most ambitious grand strategies in modern military history. Lacking a conventional air force capable of projecting power across the region and lacking the deep water navy required to dominate the sea lanes, Tehran looked to the map and identified its core vulnerability. It is a nation besieged by geography, trapped behind the Zagros Mountains, facing adversaries armed with 5th-generation fighter jets and precision-guided munitions. To survive, Iran could not fight on its own borders. It had to export the battlefield. This is the genesis of the forward defense strategy, commonly known as the axis of resistance or the ring of fire. From a purely realist perspective, it is a brilliant exploitation of asymmetric warfare. Iran essentially weaponized the collapsed states and ungoverned spaces of the Arab world. They placed Hezbollah in Lebanon to lock down the northern Israeli frontier. They armed Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza to create a permanent tactical bleed on Israel's southern flank. They organized and equipped a sprawling network of Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, transforming the Levantine corridor into a land bridge under their direct control. And crucially, they armed the Houthis in Yemen, giving Tehran a proxy hand on the throat of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. On the surface, this posture projects overwhelming strength. It creates a matrix of deterrence. If the United States or Israel contemplates striking the Iranian nuclear facilities at Natanz or Fordo, they must calculate the cost of receiving tens of thousands of rockets raining down on Tel Aviv, Haifa, and American outposts in Iraq. Iran outsourced its deterrence using Arab proxy fighters as the disposable shield for the Persian core. This is the posture of a regional hegemon operating at the peak of its strategic influence. But hard power realism demands that we look past the parade grounds and the propaganda videos. War is not a state of being. It is a massive, consuming industrial process. Maintaining an empire of proxies requires an astronomical expenditure of capital, a flawless logistical spine, and a domestic economy resilient enough to absorb the shockwaves of continuous low-grade conflict. This is where the Iranian grand strategy begins to unspool. The Ring of Fire is not self-sustaining. Every single rocket fired by Hezbollah into the Galilee, every single anti-ship ballistic missile launched by the Houthis into the Red Sea, and every single Shahed drone assembled in Syria requires a supply chain that originates in the industrial heartland of Iran. Consider the geography of this supply chain. To arm Hezbollah, weapons must be manufactured in Iranian facilities, loaded onto transport aircraft or heavily disguised convoys, flown into Damascus or Aleppo under the constant threat of Israeli radar, and then trucked across the rugged, porous border into Lebanon. This is a journey spanning over 1,000 miles of highly contested battle space. Alternatively, the land bridge requires pushing material through the deserts of western Iraq, navigating tribal territories, American intelligence, surveillance, and hostile local factions. To arm the Houthis, Iran must utilize a shadowy fleet of smuggling vessels, transferring components ship to ship in the open ocean, evading naval blockades enforced by the most advanced navies in the world. This logistical infrastructure is not only vulnerable to kinetic interdiction, it is breathtakingly expensive. Proxies are not simply enthusiastic volunteers fighting for a cause. They are standing armies. They require payrolls. They require housing, healthcare, pensions for the families of fallen fighters, and a continuous, unbroken stream of ammunition. When Hezbollah increases its rate of fire, its stockpiles deplete. Those stockpiles must be replenished, or the deterrent threat vanishes. The cost of manufacturing, transporting, and deploying these weapon systems, combined with the hard currency required to pay tens of thousands of militiamen across 4 different countries, places an immense, crushing burden on the Iranian state treasury. This brings us to the core vulnerability of the Iranian state. Power projection requires a secure and prosperous domestic base. You cannot wage an infinite war of attrition abroad if your home front is starving. And the Iranian home front is currently fracturing under the weight of unparalleled economic siege. Decades of heavy sanctions, systemic mismanagement, and the sheer financial drain of funding the axis of resistance have hollowed out the Iranian economy. The national currency, the rial, has suffered catastrophic devaluation. Hyperinflation is tearing through the middle and working classes. Industrial capacity is stymied by a lack of foreign investment and access to advanced technology. More critically, the very infrastructure that sustains the nation is decaying. Despite sitting on some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves on Earth, Iran faces chronic energy shortages, rolling blackouts, and an inability to efficiently refine its own oil into usable fuel for its population. A state that cannot keep the lights on in its own capital city is fundamentally constrained in its ability to dictate the terms of security in the Mediterranean. From a strategic standpoint, a collapsing economy is not merely a political inconvenience, it is a direct degradation of hard power. It reduces the state's ability to procure advanced components for its missile programs on the black market. It reduces the state's ability to bribe local power brokers in Iraq and Syria. It forces the leadership in Tehran to make agonizing choices between the survival of the regime at home and the maintenance of the empire abroad. The enemies of Iran understand this mathematical reality perfectly. The United States and Israel do not need to engage in a symmetric force-on-force war against the axis of resistance. They do not need to invade Lebanon or land marines in Yemen. They only need to understand the physics of the Iranian logistical network and apply maximum pressure to its weakest points. The strategy is to turn Iran's strategic depth into a strategic liability. By forcing the proxies to engage in continuous high-intensity conflict, Israel and its allies are forcing Iran to accelerate its burn rate. The more missiles the proxies fire, the more Iran must replace. The more Iran must replace, the more money it must print, the more its currency devalues, and the more fragile its domestic political situation becomes. This is the essence of a war of attrition. It is a test of endurance, a competition to see which logistical system will collapse first. Iran built the Ring of Fire to fight a cheap war, to bleed its enemies through 1,000 cuts without suffering direct damage to its sovereign territory. But the calculus has inverted. The proxies are no longer a cheap investment. They are a ravenous black hole consuming the wealth of the Iranian nation. The geopolitical board is set. The lines of supply are stretched to their absolute physical limits, and the structural integrity of the Iranian empire is being tested against the cold, hard realities of industrial warfare. But an empire extended across 3,000 miles of hostile territory is an empire vulnerable to interdiction. You do not need to defeat a proxy army on the battlefield if you can sever its umbilical cord. The strategic calculus of Washington and Jerusalem has fundamentally shifted. The target is no longer just the missile. The target is the money, the routes, and the sovereign core of Iran itself. The counter-strategy deployed against Tehran is a masterclass in multi-domain strangulation. Israel and the United States have recognized that engaging the axis of resistance purely at the tactical level, shooting down drones over the Red Sea or bombing empty launch sites in southern Lebanon, is a losing game. It is fighting the symptoms of the disease while ignoring the pathogen. To defeat a network of this scale, you must attack its nervous system and its cardiovascular network. You must attack the logistics. Watch how this plays out on the map. The Israeli Air Force has practically rewritten the doctrine of preemptive logistical warfare through its campaign in Syria, often referred to as the war between the wars. This is not a campaign designed to conquer territory. It is a systematic, relentless effort to sever the land bridge. Every time Iranian intelligence attempts to move advanced precision-guided munitions through the Damascus airport, Israeli intelligence tracks the cargo and destroys the runway. Every time a convoy of trucks crosses the Iraqi border into Syria carrying missile guidance kits, it is tracked by drones and incinerated before it can reach Hezbollah depots in the Bekaa Valley. But destroying the hardware is only half the battle. The true centers of gravity in the Iranian proxy network are the human coordinators, the senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force. These officers are not simply battlefield tacticians. They are the logistical masterminds, the shadow bankers, and the diplomats who stitch the disparate militias of the Middle East into a cohesive fighting force. When Israeli intelligence identifies and eliminates these figures, striking high-value targets in diplomatic compounds or safe houses in Damascus, they are not just killing enemy combatants. They are deleting institutional memory. They are destroying the human architecture that makes the supply chain function. Replacing a destroyed truck is simply a matter of money. Replacing an intelligence officer with 20 years of experience navigating the tribal politics of the Levant is impossible in the short term. The network becomes blind, sluggish, and uncoordinated. Simultaneously, the financial arteries of the empire are under total siege. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are sustained by capital. Iran funds its proxies through a massive, globally dispersed shadow economy. This involves illicit oil sales, complex Hawala transfer networks, front companies in third-party nations, and the smuggling of cash across porous borders. The American response is a suffocating web of financial warfare. By leveraging its control over the global banking system, the United States Treasury Department hunts down the nodes of this shadow economy, freezing assets, sanctioning shipping companies, and penalizing any international entity that facilitates Iranian commerce. This is not a theoretical exercise in economic policy. It is kinetic warfare translated into ledger balances. When an Iranian oil tanker is seized or denied entry into a port, that is millions of dollars that will never reach the payroll of a Shia militia in Baghdad. When a money exchange in Beirut is targeted by financial sanctions, that is a direct disruption of the cash flow required to buy the loyalty of local warlords. The objective is to make the act of funding the proxies so agonizingly difficult and so incredibly costly that the system simply seizes up. And here is where the blowback strikes the Iranian homeland with devastating force. The money that Tehran burns to maintain its forward defense is money stolen directly from the internal development of the state. The regime is trapped in a fatal contradiction. It demands the status of a great power, but it operates with the GDP of a sanctioned, isolated, developing nation. You cannot fund a regional empire when your domestic economy is in freefall. The Iranian government is forced to print money to cover its immense deficits, fueling a hyperinflationary spiral that eradicates the purchasing power of the average citizen. Look at the internal dynamics of Iran from a realist perspective. Domestic stability is a critical component of national security. A state that is consumed by internal unrest cannot project power externally. As the economy crumbles, the Iranian populace grows increasingly desperate and hostile to the regime. Bread riots, labor strikes, and massive protests over the lack of basic services are not merely political headaches for the Ayatollahs. They are strategic vulnerabilities. Every time the regime is forced to deploy the besieged militia or the Revolutionary Guard to crush dissent on the streets of Tehran or Isfahan, it is expending resources, manpower, and political capital that could have been used to fight its enemies abroad. The logic of escalation here is brutal and unforgiving. As the logistical and financial pressure mounts, Iran is backed into a corner. The regime must constantly recalibrate its risk tolerance. If they cut funding to the proxies to stabilize the domestic economy, the Ring of Fire collapses and their deterrence architecture falls apart, leaving them totally exposed to direct military strikes by Israel or the United States. But if they continue to siphon national wealth to fund Hezbollah and the Houthis while the Iranian people starve, they risk a total collapse of domestic authority and an internal revolution that could tear the regime apart from the inside out. This is the exact dilemma that Washington and Jerusalem have engineered. They have forced Iran to fight a two-front war, not against foreign armies, but against economic reality and internal geography. The escalation we are witnessing now is not characterized by massive tank battles or sweeping infantry offenses. It is characterized by the tightening of the noose. It is the steady, grinding destruction of the mechanisms of power. Israel pushes harder on the northern border, forcing Hezbollah to fire more rockets, forcing Hezbollah to demand more supplies from Tehran, forcing Tehran to attempt more smuggling runs, which Israel then destroys in Syria. It is a cycle designed to bankrupt the enemy. The same logic applies to the maritime domain. The Houthis, armed and directed by Iran, attempt to choke off global shipping in the Red Sea to exert economic pressure on the West. But this, too, is a massive drain on Iranian resources. Firing anti-ship ballistic missiles and launching swarms of kamikaze drones requires constant replenishment. The U.S. Navy and its coalition partners do not need to invade Yemen to neutralize this threat. They simply need to maintain a defensive posture, shoot down the incoming fire, and intensify the maritime interdiction of Iranian smuggling vessels. They are forcing Iran into a war of industrial production against the largest military-industrial complex in human history. Every move Iran makes to project power now accelerates its own internal exhaustion. The regime is attempting to sprint a marathon while carrying the dead weight of a collapsing economy. The leaders in Tehran understand this math. They know that time is not on their side. The logic of power dictates that a state cannot operate perpetually beyond its means. The proxy network was designed to be an impenetrable shield, a geographic fortress that kept the war far away from Iranian cities. But the war has breached the fortress. It has not arrived via bombers or cruise missiles. It has arrived via inflation, severed supply chains, and the slow, inevitable starvation of the imperial periphery. The collapse of a supply line does not happen overnight. It is a slow, agonizing starvation. And as the Iranian core hollows out under the weight of its own imperial overstretch, the proxy network is left exposed. The balance of power in the Middle East is now pivoting on a devastating reality. When the logistical arteries finally dry up, the battlefield geometry of the Middle East fundamentally transforms. We are entering a phase where the limits of Iranian hard power are no longer theoretical. They are being physically demonstrated in real time. The bankruptcy of the proxy network is not a sudden explosion. It is a gradual, systemic failure of capacity. And as this failure cascades through the region, the balance of power shifts sharply, reshaping the strategic calculus of every nation from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Look first at Lebanon, the absolute cornerstone of the Iranian forward defense strategy. Hezbollah has spent decades building an arsenal designed to overwhelm Israeli air defenses, creating a deterrent threshold so high that Israel would never dare risk a full-scale war. But an arsenal is finite. In a sustained conflict, the rate of fire dictates the rate of survival. If the Iranian supply lines through Syria are severed, and the treasury in Tehran can no longer provide the massive cash infusions required to sustain operations, Hezbollah faces a catastrophic strategic deficit. They are forced to ration their munitions. They must calculate every barrage, knowing that what they fire today cannot be replaced tomorrow. This logistical starvation strips Hezbollah of its primary weapon, the threat of unlimited escalation. Israel, possessing vastly superior intelligence, air power, and a resupply line backed by the American defense establishment, recognizes this weakness. The Israeli military can systematically dismantle Hezbollah's infrastructure, hunt its leadership, and destroy its launch sites with the confidence that the enemy lacks the industrial depth to replace its losses. Hezbollah transitions from a strategic deterrent into a besieged, localized militia, fighting a desperate war of survival rather than a war of regional dominance. The northern threat to Israel is not eliminated, but it is fundamentally downgraded. Now shift your gaze to the Red Sea. The Houthi campaign to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb Strait relies entirely on sophisticated Iranian technology. The Houthis do not manufacture anti-ship ballistic missiles in the mountains of Yemen. They assemble components smuggled in by the Quds Force, utilizing targeting data provided by Iranian intelligence ships operating in the region. When the economic vice tightens on Tehran, the maritime smuggling routes become too expensive and too risky to maintain its scale. The flow of advanced weaponry to Yemen slows to a trickle. Without constant Iranian resupply and technical support, the Houthi blockade becomes unsustainable. The U.S. and allied naval forces possessing overwhelming sea control can systematically degrade the remaining Houthi launch capabilities. The choke point reopens. The strategic leverage that Iran attempted to wield over the global economy evaporates. The Houthis, like Hezbollah, are reduced to their local geographic footprint, capable of causing regional nuisance but stripped of their ability to project power on a global scale. The peripheral nodes of the Iranian Empire are being amputated one by one. This cascading failure of the proxy network has profound consequences for the wider regional architecture. The Sunni Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan are watching this dynamic with intense strategic interest. For years, the Gulf capitals lived under the shadow of Iranian hegemony, terrified by the reach of Tehran's missiles and the subversion of its proxy militias. But as the physical limitations of the axis of resistance are exposed, the fear dissipates. The perceived invincibility of the Iranian model is shattered. This accelerates the realignment of the Middle East. The Arab states recognize that the American-Israeli security umbrella, backed by unmatched logistical and economic power, remains the only viable architecture in the region. The trend toward normalization with Israel, driven by mutual fear of Iran, is reinforced not by diplomatic goodwill, but by cold, hard realism. The Arab powers see that aligning with the bloc that controls the sea lanes, the financial systems, and the advanced technology is the only guarantee of survival. Iran is left geographically contained and diplomatically isolated, watching its sphere of influence contract back toward its own borders. This brings us to the ultimate terrifying logic of the strategic endgame. A weakened power is often a dangerous power. As the conventional deterrent of the proxy network crumbles, the regime in Tehran faces an existential crisis. They have spent 40 years bleeding their country dry to build this empire, and now the empire is starving. The geographic shield has failed. The economic foundation is cracked. In the ruthless calculus of state survival, when conventional power projection is no longer viable, a state will inevitably look for an asymmetric alternative to guarantee its security. For Iran, that alternative is nuclear breakout. If the regime concludes that the axis of resistance can no longer deter American or Israeli aggression, and that the domestic situation is spiraling toward collapse, the threshold for weaponizing their nuclear program drops significantly. A nuclear warhead becomes the final, desperate insurance policy for state survival. This is the ultimate escalation point, driven not by strength, but by profound structural weakness. It forces a binary choice upon the United States and Israel. Accept a nuclear-armed Iran, which alters the global balance of power permanently, or launch a massive preemptive military strike against the Iranian homeland, sparking a regional war of unimaginable devastation. This is the inescapable reality of the geopolitical board. You cannot separate the military from the economic, and you cannot separate the geographic from the logistical. Iran attempted to defy the constraints of its own geography by building an empire on the cheap, utilizing ideology and proxy warfare to project a mirage of overwhelming strength. But the laws of power are absolute. An empire without an industrial base, without secure supply lines, and without a functioning domestic economy is an empire built on sand. The collapse we are witnessing is not a matter of morality or justice. It is a matter of mathematics. It is the triumph of logistics over rhetoric. The thousands of missiles buried in the hills of Lebanon and the deserts of Yemen are useless if the men who guard them cannot be fed and the state that built them cannot survive its own internal rot. The proxy bankruptcy is complete. The ring of fire is burning out. And as the ashes settle, the geopolitical map of the Middle East is being redrawn, dictated by the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of hard power.